I'm Ken, and you're watching Redheaded Readings, which is what I'm calling this new segment on Kilt Can Cook, the Scottish cooking channel that encourages young men and women to have the confidence and competence they need to conquer the kitchen. But today we're reading nothing. No, today we're cooking nothing, but we're reading something. Aye, that's right. We're going to be reading a short story called At the Edge of Detachment by a young lady of the name A.M. Freeman. And this story comes from us from the book Forbidden Thoughts, and it was published by Superversive Press. All the links are down in the video description below. I highly recommend you check it out. The book was very inexpensive. I think it was $4.99 on Kindle when I got it, and it's very good. I highly recommend it. Some very high name authors you might recognise. It's definitely worth a read. Anyway, A Dystopian Future by young Miss Freeman. Oh, pardon me. Terribly sorry, I have to switch to my posh accent because nobody wants to hear a Scottish brogue reading a story, especially a story about a dystopian future. Remember, this is not an audiobook reading. It will not be perfect. It is just me reading you a story. A very good story, I might add. At the Edge of Detachment by A.M. Freeman, a subheading, What if you were not alive, but the executioner was at your door? 13 years. Only 1 year more and he would be 13. Finally, he'd be considered alive. The official papers would be filled out and he could become his own person. He had only to wait 1 more year. Then he would be detached. He would officially choose his name. He could celebrate his birthdays. He'd have his own papers, his own rights, and his freedoms. He'd been so sure, positive, that he'd make it. Just like so many other kids at his age, he dreamed and hoped for that moment. He imagined what it would be like to be a real person. He'd even planned what he'd wanted to do. Go to schools and learn new things. Go on adventures and see the world and be certain he'd have a future. All had been going well. Mother had been happy and he was being more of a help than a burden to her. Freedom and humanity had seemed within his reach. But now, this broken arm might cost him more than just climbing trees for a while. He wished he could be in a tree now, out in the woods behind his neighbourhood. He liked it out there. It was much better than this cramped house. It was out there where he and his friends would meet, out there where he could say what he liked, out there where he kept his secret. He'd never told Mother, since it was something he shouldn't be able to do, but he had learned how to read. This had happened some time ago, while spending the day in the woods with his friends. On that day they had found a vault half buried in the ground. There were many strange and old things in that vault, but most of all, there were books. Having not been allowed any formal education, none of them knew what the books said or meant, but over time, and with any information they could glean from home and the books themselves, together they learned to read. Some of the books were boring, to him at least, but others were full of stories. Wonderful, incredible stories from times far past. And on these stories, he and his friends had thrived. They were fascinating stories, but to them, almost unbelievable. He and his friends argued over whether such a time could have ever existed, where most children would have a mother and a father at the same time. Or if it was true that back then, kids started learning in schools only 4 or 5 years after birth. Of course, there were rumours that richer families paid for private tutoring for their children before they were fully developed, but there was never any evidence. They had enough money to keep things like that quiet. Could there really have been a time where everyone lived like that? In a big family, going to schools, living and working where and how they wanted? While he believed there was truth in these stories, not all of them could agree or decide what was real or not, and it troubled them. So together they'd built a dream, and a promise. They'd make it to the age of detachment. They'd learn, and they'd find the truth. He wanted to find the truth so badly. He hated being kept in the dark, pushed aside like he wasn't even there. But he has ruined any chance of that. All because he'd climbed a tree a little too high and fallen, and now was stuck with this. The crippled arm hung heavy against his chest in the homemade cast. It was something he'd learned in one of the books, something called a splint. However, having only one hand and the materials in his room to work with, it was a lot sloppier than the picture in the book had been. But with 2 sticks, thick paper, and some string, he'd managed to pull it together enough to support his damaged arm. Plus, the many hours he'd spent in his room had numbed it some. He looked at the cast. With all the names crudely scribbled on, it looked like a graveyard. He had put them there himself, for his own sake. If he was going to have to leave, he wanted to remember his friends who'd gone before him. Donna. She'd stayed out too late. Ricky. He'd kept forgetting his chores. Little Jim. He was too much of a stress and wasn't healthy. And then there was Emmy. Everyone said dependents like him and all his friends didn't really have life until they were detached at puberty. It was said they couldn't really feel or understand things yet. But if anyone had life, it was Emmy. And if there was any feeling to be felt, he knew he felt them. Emmy was the nicest, sweetest, kindest, most beautiful girl ever. Or at least she was. She had asked too many questions one night when her mother had gotten home drunk. But Emmy was always like that, curious about everything. She'd been one of the first to figure out how to read, then had been able to help the others, especially him. Her mother owned a gun, so at least it was swift for her. Sometimes he wondered where kids went when they were disposed. Can the unalive die? He wondered as his finger traced Emmy's name. He hoped he wouldn't find out, but he had seen the look on Mother's face when she had seen the broken arm. He had seen that look before, when her career demanded she eliminate stress and focus on her work. That stress happened to be his 2-year-old sister. She was on his cast too. Lucy the cutie, that's what he'd liked calling her. Mother had that same look when she'd seen his arm that morning. What scared him more was that it had stayed even as she'd left for work. She'd be back any time now. He worried what she would say, what would happen next. Worried that his arm would never get a chance to heal. He knew she needed rent, not to mention those shoes she'd had her eyes on, and he was already cutting in on expenses. He knew. He had seen the bills. If only he'd been able to make it one more year. He was so close. He heard footsteps. There was the clicking of heels, but also the stomping of several pairs of boots. He froze, realizing Mother was not alone. His heart jumped in his throat as all of his worst fears flashed before him. The rush of panic made him jump towards the window, but the sudden lurch sent a stab of pain through his broken arm. He bit his lip hard to stop himself from screaming and tasted blood in his mouth. Tears filled his eyes and blurred his vision as he cradled his arm and looked frantically for an escape. The footsteps were closer. He could hear voices. Something was happening to his head. He was suddenly hyper-focused on analyzing the closet, the window, the door, looking for the best way out. Because all he could think about was running, escaping, not dying, staying alive. But how can I die if I'm not alive? The thought cost him a precious few seconds, and by then it was too late. The footsteps stopped, keys jingled, and the doorknob turned. Through the partly open door, Mother's head poked in, a sweet smile on her face. "There he is. Come in, gentlemen." She pushed the door open, and 5 burly men in white coats walked in. One of them was holding a briefcase. Mother stayed outside. He looked at the men. He knew what they meant, and this brutal realization made his voice cracked as he asked, despite already knowing and dreading the answer. "Mother? What's going on?" He didn't take his eyes off the men. He hardly even blinked, and his feet started backing him towards the closet. He had a distant hope that maybe he could hide in there until he woke up from this bad dream. He hoped this was a dream. This couldn't really be happening. "I've thought about it a lot," Mother said, still hovering in the doorway. "And now it's just not a good time. That arm will only cause you pain, and it would be better for my health and security if I did not have to support you with it. It's for my health and well-being, darling, as well as yours. And the money." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Something strange was happening to him. His heart was beating faster. He could feel the blood pumping through him, and he had a heightened sense of the danger he was in. She was going to have him disposed of. He knew she was. She just said it herself in a roundabout way. There was no way he was going to get out of here now. Not with this arm, and not with 5 men twice his size and age. But something bubbled up inside of him. An anger, a defiance he'd never felt before, and he realized something. They were liars. They were all liars. But they weren't going to take him. Not without a fight. "I'm sure they'll give you a lot of money for my body. Just like you got that fat raise after you killed my little sister." "Honey, you know better than that. Lucy was never really alive, just like you aren't. It won't hurt." "Lies!" he shouted. Mother looked startled, but he didn't care. She wasn't his mother, not like the ones in the stories. She was an imposter, a sick mockery. The men made a semicircle, trapping him in the corner. He ran back and forth, looking for an escape, and shouted, "You didn't hear her scream. You had your daughter murdered, and you were too much of a coward to stick around and hear her scream." Mother's face grew red with rage. "That is enough, child. Don't make this harder than it has to be. This is for me. Don't you love your mother?" "You are no mother, you selfish witch." He could no longer feel the pain in his arm, and his eyes blazed as he ran back and forth, sweat pouring from his brow and his heart drumming in his ears. "Why should I love you when you didn't love me? You are not a mother. Mothers don't kill their own children." Mother's face was a mask of total insult and horror. "I gave birth to you. Do you know how hard that is?" "You mean how they doped you up on drugs and cut me out of your stomach so you could parade me around until you got bored or I became too much stress? You mean like that? Just like you did with Lucy." His hands shook as he stopped pacing and looked at her. Anger and disgust settled in his stomach like a boiling fire. He felt the pain from all those times she'd rejected and neglected him when he needed to be held. The despair he'd endured when the only times he'd received her affection was in the company of others. All the unjust acts and fake love she'd given him boiled and writhed, burning away any faith he'd had left in her. His voice, hardly more than a whisper, came out like sheets of ice. Every word trembled with venom as he stood still, clenched his fists, looking at her with a gaze that turned from pain to hatred. "You may have grown me in your stomach. You may have even let me have your food and shelter. But you were never a mother to me." Mother was beyond speech. Her eyes bored into her son, but her rage had no effect on him. Her anger was inflamed by his resilience to it, and she snapped her fingers. The men started moving closer. But he didn't stop. He started pacing again, then sprinted back and forth, his blood racing as he shouted, "A real mother loves her children. She cares about them first. She holds them when they're crying. She doesn't go out late and leave them without dinner. A real mother doesn't dispose of her children, because I'm alive, and disposing is killing. Don't kill me!" The men had grabbed him. Each of his limbs were held by one of them, and they lifted him up into the air. Sudden panic hit as they trapped him, and he struggled and yelled, "I'm alive! Don't kill me! Don't kill me! I'm alive!" He thrashed in their arms, blood pumping in his ears. His breath came hard and short, and his mind raced. As he struggled, he saw scenes from his life flash before him. Little Doozy and her death, and friends he'd lost in the same way. He remembered his friends, the books and Emmy, and he wondered if he could think, he could feel, he could reason, if he could do everything the adults could. How could they think he wasn't alive? For the first time, his mother looked unsure, watching the boy struggle and scream with such intensity, and she glanced at one of the specialists in their white coats. "Don't worry, Mum. It's an underdeveloped reaction in the brain. This happens sometimes, nothing serious. You just go relax, this won't take long." The man set the briefcase on the bed and opened it. When the boy saw it, he began to thrash harder and scream louder. The men pulled a long white cloth from the case and tied the gag in the boy's mouth. He stared at his mother as she slowly turned from the door, his eyes wide and truly afraid. He tried to scream her name, to get her to come back and see what she was doing. He had no love for this woman, but maybe if he could get her to turn back, to see what she was really doing, maybe he could break that cold bubble she lived in. But in the end, he knew she wouldn't. He'd seen her do this before, and too many like her had done the same. Now it was his turn to be condemned by her, condemned by this whole damned world, this world that was so different from the one he'd read in the stories, this world that was so easy to excuse life that was not its own, this world that had no love. She didn't love him. She hadn't loved either of them. It was only a status symbol to look like you cared about your children. He heard his own voice screaming inside his head. Then the man with the gloves from the briefcase. Then the man with the briefcase was pulling on white gloves. He strained his neck to look at the doorway. Mother was gone. He felt a stab of pain as all hope suddenly drained from him. The man in the white gloves picked up a long, curved needle and began walking towards him. The boy's terror was beyond measure. As he fought for his life, he managed to get the gag out, and his screams were shrill and horrific. "No! I don't want to die! I don't want to die!" As he jerked and screamed, the pain in his broken arm became unbearable. He looked at his cast, now twisted and falling apart. His eyes focused on Emmy's name as the needle went in, and a last thought lingered in his mind. Maybe I'll see her again. Then the pain hit, and a split second later the numbness. He threw back his head and screamed one last time, then went completely limp. The money was paid, his body put in the back of a coal van to be cut up, used, and distributed. And the mother put on a short dress and went out for a drink. That was At the Edge of Detachment by A.M. Freeman. It is a dystopian future, and hopefully one will not experience. But like all dystopians, it's a warning, of course. So, if you liked that story, I recommend clicking the link down below to buy Forbidden Thought by Superversive Press. It has lots of other stories, some like this, some not, some fiction, some non-fiction. It's very good. I highly recommend it. But in the meantime, you're watching Redheaded Readings. We are a part of Celt Can Cook, the Scottish cooking channel that encourages young men and women to have the confidence and competence they need to conquer the kitchen. Cheers and happy reading.